Hi everyone who's here in person and here online. Thank you for joining us for the third week in our June lecture series. Today's speaker is Paul Russell. Paul is an artist and an author. He's authored this book, Through Woods on Water, historical fiction novel about Étienne Brûlé. And today his subject is Étienne Brûlé in Huronia. So without further ado, Paul.
Thank you, Iris. So as was said in that introduction, my subject is the life of Étienne Brûlé. And it's in this novel, it's fictional, historical fiction, and its setting is the vast forests, waterways of the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes. And their place in time is the early 17th century. This is the saga of a great explorer from Europe, who was the first to learn the languages of his hosts in the New World. He lived with the Wendat, whom the French called Huron, on the shores of Georgian Bay and adapted to their ways. His mentor, Samuel Champlain, encouraged his exploits. The French missionaries who followed him to Huronia were dismayed by his behavior, perhaps because he adapted so well. His antithesis in class, education, and temperament was the missionary Jean de Brébeuf. They were about the same age. Both sought to befriend indigenous peoples for different motives, and both died at their hands. And now I'd like to show you a monument that has been removed. It exemplifies a common misunderstanding of the relationships in early 17th century Canada. This is the Champlain monument that once stood in Champlain Park in Huronia. Erected in 1925, it is the work of English sculptor Vernon March. He also created the National War Memorial Museum, the War Memorial in Ottawa. Why it was removed has as much to do with the hierarchy of figures, which you can see clearly here, as well as the race references in the inscription. The monument portrays Champlain at the top, Samuel Champlain, governor, the father of New France, standing above all, in control, decked out in all his finery. Then below him, a fur trader, also well-dressed, perhaps too well-dressed for time and place, especially if it's Brûlé. Sorry. There. And on the other side is a Jesuit priest, probably modeled on images of Jean de Brébeuf, vehemently interacting and instructing the curious indigenous Huron below. In fact, the power dynamics of the time were exactly the opposite. Here you see Champlain at the top, then the priest or fur trader, then the indigenous. But it was in fact the opposite. The populous Huron Confederacy was roughly 50,000 strong at the time. They dominated the region in every way. In these early years of contact with the French, the Iroquois were only a nuisance to their trade, and European diseases had not yet appeared. The fur trade only survived because they wanted it. Exploration was carried out with their help or permission. At this stage, the fur trade employed Champlain, and the missionaries were financed by rich French patrons, and as thus would insist on their plans and might inform Champlain. This is the setting, Samuel Champlain, with a few dozen colonists in Quebec, tried to keep competing forces in conversation to support his vision of a French permanent colony in the then unoccupied St. Lawrence Valley at Quebec. This is the setting into which Étienne Brûlé, our Canadien errant, as I will call him, ventures. Un Canadien errant is a classic French-Canadian melody written by Antoine Guérin-Lajoie in 1842 as a lament for the patriots of the 1837 rebellion in Lower Canada, who were exiled to Australia, never to return. I think for many around the world, it has become part of the haunting mythology of Canada, as it evokes an imagery of solitary wanderings over vast distances in our country and beyond. Un Canadien errant threads through much of Canadian cultural history to this day. The subject of my novel, Through Woods on Water, is the historical figure Étienne Brûlé, born over 400 years ago, an early errant or wandering Canadian. Now for some background on him, let's look at the 17th century world that Étienne inhabited and follow his wanderings. First, Paris at that time. And here we have it. A medieval city with Renaissance interventions, such as the Pont Neuf at the bottom of this image, the new bridge over the Seine linking the Ile de la Cité with right and left banks. And in the middle of the bridge, a new statue of Henry IV, the king who supported Champlain's enterprises in the New World. And there's also the impressive Place Royale, another grand project of Le Roi Henri, a vast square surrounded by uniform building facades, the first of its kind in Europe and soon to be copied everywhere. Having passed through all of this, as a 15-year-old boy, he crosses the Atlantic in a rather small sailing vessel as a member of Champlain's party destined to establish a permanent settlement on the St. Lawrence. Their ship, the Don de Dieu, or Gift of God, was small by today's standards, cramped and uncomfortable. Champlain's party prayed and hoped and successfully anchored at Tadoussac after just 7 weeks on the ocean. They had been fortunate, and they had survived, and it had been a relatively short trip. Now they found themselves in the New World, known as Turtle Island to the peoples who live here. Once established, he saw the vast Gulf of St. Lawrence, then Tadoussac, a meeting place for trade, which had been used by the French in the summer season regularly for decades. Beyond it, the great Saguenay River flowing down from the mountains in the west. Further upstream, he would pass the great waterfall later named Montmorency. The would-be settlers, of whom Brûlé was included, came to a narrowing of the river at Quebec, where a small walled habitation was built. Over the years that followed, Brûlé traveled west on the French River to the woodlands and meadows of Huronia on the south shores of Georgian Bay, which he knew as the Sweetwater Sea. He experienced the seasons by the Great Lakes, wintered with the Wendat Huron, learning their language and adapting their ways. He would have lived in a longhouse like this, and the way of life must have suited him because he stayed for many years. The French word errant can be translated as wandering, also as lost. This is an ambivalence that resonates with Étienne, as it does with such later figures as explorers Alexander Mackenzie and Simon Fraser, or political leader Louis Riel, the 19th century patriots who inspired the aforementioned song, Métis poet Pauline Johnson, who wrote about such wanderings in the song My Paddle Sings, and artists Emily Carr and Tom Thompson. Carr wandered solitary in the British Columbian forests, painting towering trees and their swirling branches above her, while Thompson evokes the same limitless, haunting, natural world, alone with his paint box in his canoe in the bushlands of northern Ontario. Étienne, or Stephen in English, Brûlé, haunts the Canadian imagination. He is mythic, precisely because there is so much mystery surrounding his exploits. There is very little direct contemporary reference to him, and much of it is secondhand and ambivalent. Here are the bare facts of his life that have come down to us from his contemporaries. He left no writings of his own, and we can assume that his reading and writing skills were minimal. But his skills in learning a language and his social skills in dealing alone with a foreign people must have been astounding. Étienne was born in 1492 in France and was raised probably in Champigny-sur-Marne, close to Paris. He arrived in what was claimed as New France in 1608 and wintered in Champlain's quickly assembled habitation at Quebec. He survived the fierce cold, but many of his friends died of scurvy. 2 years later, he traveled alone with the Huron Wendat and spent the winter of 1610-11 with them in their country by the Sweetwater Sea and learned their language. This was a skill that would make him a truchement, or a conduit, for the French fur trade with the Wendat. He seems to have spent most of his remaining years with these indigenous people. It was assumed by his contemporaries that he fathered children, as his critics railed about his scandalous life. And so he is certainly the first European to settle in what is now Ontario, the first Franco-Ontarian. But I would argue that he's more than that. Étienne Brûlé could be considered the first Canadian. He arrived as a European, but within a few years, he was living with the Wendat as one of them, and ultimately refuted his European heritage. He seems to have been that first mix of immigrant and indigenous that is more and more the aspiration of Canadian culture today. This Brûlé was also an explorer. He was the first European to see all of the Great Lakes. He was probably the first European to visit the site of Toronto when he used the Toronto Porter's route from Lake Simcoe to Lake Ontario via the Humber River as he made his way south in 1615. Did he see Burlington Bay or Niagara Falls? He might well have passed both on this journey. He later reported to Champlain that in that year or the next, after a failed rendezvous with his mentor and the Wendat in enemy Iroquoian territory, he wintered with a people further south, known to the French as the Andastes, and with them explored a river that flowed south into the ocean near Florida. Later historians conjecture that if this story is true, and not a fantasy to explain his long absence, the river that he traveled was the Susquehanna. In our imagination, the wandering Canadian is always solo. But of course, Brûlé didn't go anywhere alone. He was always traveling with the permission or cooperation of Indigenous companions, who knew the water routes of Canada that had been long established by their communities. They took him along. In 1629, when he was 37 years old, Brûlé turned his back on Europe by betraying Champlain, the man who had brought him to Quebec in 1608. He helped the privateering Kirke brothers, who flew the colors of the King of England, to capture Fort St. Louis at Quebec and force Champlain to leave the country. His motives are unknown, but there has of course been conjecture. Personal jealousies? Did he see himself as a Wendat and now resent the French and Champlain? Or was it part of a returning animosity between Catholic and Huguenot after the assassination of Henry IV? Such animosity had already disrupted the fur trade, and the Kirk brothers were French-speaking Norman Huguenots. He then returned to what the French called Huronia, to live with his adopted people, the Huron-Wendat, in the village of Tues, on the shores of what is now Georgian Bay. Abruptly, in 1633, his community turned on him and killed him. Why? This is a drawing by C.W. Jeffries. Brûlé was a controversial figure in his own time. Many admired him and many reviled him. Champlain seemed fond of him in the early years, referring to him as mon garçon, my boy or lad, who ran the treacherous rapids at Lachine on the St. Lawrence River above the site of Montreal in 1611. Later, the Recollet missionary Gabriel Sagard admired his knowledge of the Wendat language, and he was doubtless of great use to Sagard in his writing of a dictionary of that language. Won't move. The Jesuits, François-Joseph Le Mercier, Paul Lejeune, and Jean de Brébeuf, were critical of his crude ways of living in the manner of the Wendat. After 1629, Champlain could no longer speak well of him, writing that he was vicious with a weakness for women. And what did the Wendat think of him? All we know is that he lived among them and traveled on trade missions with them for many years. And what was it like for a European to live among the Huron? The aristocratic, well-educated Jean de Brébeuf gives us a hint in an essay by him in the Jesuit Relations of 1636, which was just 3 years after Brûlé's death. This is his advice to future missionaries, who, if they're planning to go to Huronia. You must have sincere affection for the Huron, looking upon them as ransomed by the blood of the Son of God, and as our brethren with whom we are to pass the rest of our lives. To conciliate the Huron, you must be careful never to make them wait for you in embarking. Tuck up your gown so that they will not get wet, and so that you will not carry either water or sand into the canoe. Be careful not to annoy anyone in the canoe with your hat. It would be better to take your nightcap. You must provide yourself with a tinderbox or with a burning mirror, or with both, to furnish them fire in the daytime to light their pipes, and in the evening when they have to encamp. These are little services that win their hearts. Each missionary should be provided with half a gross of awls, 2 or 3 dozen little knives called jambettes, 100 fish hooks, and some beads of plain or colored glass with which to buy fish or other articles when the tribes meet with each other. You should try to eat their sagamite or salmagunni in the way they prepare it, although it may be dirty, half-cooked, and very tasteless. As to the other numerous things which may be unpleasant, they must be endured for the love of God, without saying anything or appearing to notice them. It is well at first to take everything they offer, although you may not be able to eat it at all, for when one becomes somewhat accustomed to it, there is not too much adjustment necessary. You must try to be and appear always cheerful. You must so conduct yourself as not to be at all troublesome to even one of these Hurons. Do not undertake anything unless you would desire to continue it. For example, do not begin to paddle unless you are inclined to continue paddling. Finally, understand that the Huron will retain the same opinion of you in their country that they will have formed on the way. and one who has passed for an irritable and troublesome person will have considerable difficulty afterwards in removing this opinion. That's from Jean de Brebeuf. It was probably easier for Étienne Brûlé to adapt because when he was with the Huron for the first time, he was only 18. Brûlé and Brebeuf did meet in 1626 at Quebec before the priest's first foray in Huronia. As I said, both were about the same age, at this point 34 years old. Brûlé, a semi-literate fur trader who had been with the Huron for over a decade, living freely among les sauvages, and Jean de Brebeuf, of an illustrious Norman family, Jesuit-schooled, highly civilized, and newly arrived man on a mission. In my novel, Through Woods on Water, I offer a fictionalized picture of this meeting, an image of priest and fur trader discussing the powerful people whose acceptance they both seek. I'll read you a passage of that. On his return to Quebec in the spring of 1626, the tireless novice missionary applied himself immediately to more lessons in the Huron language from the Truchement Brûlé. Brebeuf was determined to be in Huronia, that western country by the Sweetwater Sea, for the following winter. As the weeks passed and the snows melted away, the imposing black robe was determined to learn, repeating Étienne's enunciated sounds of the Wendat language and writing down the expected spelling of each word as best he could. It was June, by a cooking fire just outside the residence. A fish stew had been taken, and the other residents had returned to the house for prayer or sleep. The rough teacher and the refined pupil were alone. In his eloquent French, Brebeuf inquired, "Do the Huron have any beliefs concerning the world and their place in it?" "Yes, they have many beliefs and eagerly recount many stories. They understand the forests and mountains of this land to rise from the back of a giant turtle. The turtle was given life by the great Manitou who created everything. There is also a great mother who rose from the waters. And there are brothers Tuiskaron and Uskia, who quarreled endlessly as they molded the valleys and rivers on the back of the turtle. The Holy Spirit has inspired these people with a hint of the Virgin Mary and the rivalry of Cain and Abel. Do they hope for life after death? They trust that the spirits of animals and people who have died wander the forest and can help or hurt the living." It was a cool night with a breeze off the water. They huddled close to the dying fire. The priest continued, "I have read Le Sieur de Champlain's descriptions of these meticulous torture of captives. Is this so?" "Yes, it is their custom. They will strip the skin, pull out fingernails, burn, singe, and stab their prisoners over many hours. If a captive endures suffering and dies without complaint, he is noble and brave." As he said this, Étienne rubbed his mutilated hand, remembering his torment by the Seneca. The priest paused and pressed his well-shaped hands very close to the fire, too close. If there was pain, he did not show it, but resumed his musings. "This is a verity, to endure suffering as our Lord did on the cross, to suffer for your faith, is noble indeed. If you die then, such a death is to be welcomed. It is to give all for the greater glory of God. I look forward to meeting these Hurons." Only then did the hands withdraw from the fire. The tip of a finger was singed. Étienne wondered about this strange, imposing Jesuit priest who willfully endured pain and glowed when he talked of violent death. The Truchement understood the addiction of self-imposed pain. He shared it. But is this where it led? The black robe's deep grey eyes were excited by the imaginings of violent death. What would it be like, such an end to this life, the experience of it? Étienne shuddered at that. The priest seemed to yearn for it. And that's my fictionalized meeting of Étienne and Brébeuf. And that concludes my talk. Any questions?
So, Paul, yeah, what the passage you just read, so in the Jesuit relations, they talk about desiring and wanting martyrdom.
Mm-hmm. Brébeuf talked about it.
Yeah, so they look forward to
Mm-hmm.
being martyred.
Mm-hmm. Probably not all of them, but he certainly did.
Yeah.
He talked about it. And I think any Jesuit in the 17th century who committed himself going to, North or South America, the probability was that there would be a violent death.
But instead of shuddering at it, they yearn.
Mm-hmm. 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 Did anyone see that movie Mission years ago?
No.
It's the same time, same relationships. And I'm talking about the Canadian identity with the emphasis on the Indigenous. It was very apparent when the King read the throne speech and who was in the chamber. There were lots of Indigenous leaders were assembled for that.
With their headdress.
With everything on, yeah. Because it is so. You're no longer an individual. You are that, as the king is. He's not Charles. He's that. He's the king.
Is there any insight into why he was killed?
Who? Brûlé?
Yeah.
Oh, well, as I said, it's just talk. Some of the Jesuits were back the following year, and they reported that there was great dismay among the people at Tues. In fact, they abandoned the site. They felt that what they had done was terrible, and they tried to move his bones. There was a great to-do about him, so they were very mixed about the murder. They were of two minds about it. This was afterwards. But another theory is that he had been trading with the neutrals and they were jealous. There are all kinds of possibilities out there, since we know nothing at all. We know that there was general confusion in Tues afterwards. They were very upset about it. But they'd done it. And then of course the British, the English had just restored Quebec to France. So there had been that for 3 years. Champlain wasn't there, and they had become very attached to him. So there are all kinds of possibilities. And again, as I stressed with the Kirk brothers, to the people at Quebec, they would have seen they were French. They were Norman French, but they were privateers for the King of England.
Kind of hard to know who your friends are.
Well, exactly. And of course the religious thing. Under Henry, there had been the Edict of Toleration. Henry had been the supporter of Champlain. And until Henry's assassination, it didn't matter. You could be Catholic or Huguenot. You could go to New France, or you could run the fur trade. So the Decam brothers, or famously, one was Catholic, one was Huguenot. And then after Henry's assassination, Marie de Medici was the regent because the son was too young, and she was of course very Catholic. So she's gradually, the toleration just gradually reduced until by the time of Richelieu there was none. It was over. But that happened, and then for instance the Cam brothers, the Huguenot brother had been running the trade from Quebec, but then it was the edict came from the monarch that the monarchy that only Catholics could be in the province. So all the Huguenots had to leave. And so the Catholic brother stayed and the Huguenot brother ran it from France. But these restrictions kept eating away over the next 10 years.
Hmm.
So it's the Henry IV was the reason that all of it that Champlain happened. He was the
Yeah.
one. It might not have happened if it had been 20 years later.
So when you did your research, Paul, what was the source material most reliable? The Jesuits' writings from
The Jesuit relations, those are the contemporary. And there's lots of it. I mean, Sagard and the Recollets wrote. Sagard wrote. He was a Recollet, but he wrote, and all of the Jesuits wrote because, of course, that's what they did.
That's what we did,
And the relations were kind of a bestseller. That's how the money was raised because people were fascinated by these stories from the New World.
I was just curious if there was sort of a more honest appraisal of sort of the indigenous.
Well, Champlain wrote in great detail too. He wrote his writings are very favorable.
Yeah,
No,
it's
he-
interesting because
Yeah,
also we went to school. There was just the history that we were taught was just utterly dismissive of any indigenous culture.
that was early 20th
Yeah, I was
century.
saying,
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
you know,
But at the time, Champlain wanted these allies because there were
oh, they
maybe
got-
100 people.
Yes, exactly. No choice. You're gonna survive, man.
And he never, and even later, as the French kept expanding the borders of New France, they never saw it as the mass immigration that happened in New England and Virginia. That was never part of the deal. They probably saw themselves they saw the king as a kind of hegemonic ruler over all these nations.
Sure.
There was French settlement around Detroit. There was French settlement around St. Louis, but relatively small, 100 people, a couple of hundred people. I know lots of people in the trade, like in the fur trade. They were all over the place.
And Champlain also died
He died on Christmas Day, 1635.
but he was murdered too.
No, Champlain wasn't murdered.
Oh, he was.
Oh,
He
no,
died
no,
in
no.
October.
He just died.
Okay,
Died in bed.
okay.
But he made it back to Quebec. He was kicked. He was forced out in 1629. He spent a year in London negotiating with the French embassy to persuade France to want it back, because they didn't know whether they wanted it back. But he won out. Then he was restored to go back and run, and he was elevated. He became virtual governor by 1633. But then he was only 2 more years. He was dead.
Is there any suggestion that Brûlé had any descendants?
Yeah, it's assumed.
It would be a reasonable assumption.
Yeah, it's assumed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of Métis, numerous Métis in
Yeah.
Canada. So, and it started then.
He's a pioneer in many ways.
Yeah, it started then. Because these fur traders who wintered over, well,
Yeah.
they certainly weren't celibate.
That's a
So,
good bet.
You mentioned he wasn't all that well educated because he was young.
yeah, he left no writings, nothing.
So he didn't write any accounts?
No,
They were
nothing.
all-
Not that. That's why we assume he was illiterate, because he left nothing.
And yet the stories seem
Yeah.
to crop up on.
Well, there were 3 references from Champlain, and the one about mon garçon, or my lad, he doesn't name him. We assume that's who he means, because he says he was the one who had been with the Huron for a year, so we assume that's the one.
That many.
but he's not named.
And does he appear in any indigenous accounts or in?
Well, there's nothing written down.
Nothing written down
no.
there, no, but.
May well have been oral accounts among the Huron, but I don't know if any of them survived. But they didn't write anything down at that point. It would be oral only.
And migratory, they moved.
And well, the Huron were fixed. They didn't.
Oh.
They were farmers,
Mhm.
like the Iroquois. They were farmers. They weren't nomads.
Yeah.
They stayed there. They would move their villages, like they'd farm around the village, and when after 5 or 6 years, when they exhausted the fields, they'd move the whole village, and they stay there until those fields are exhausted.
Now we have a fallow year.
Yeah, but they didn't do that. They just farmed it until it wasn't working anymore, so they moved. Yeah, where the Algonquin were nomadic. They were summer by the river and in the meadows, and then the winter would be in the forest for the big game. And they would move. They never had a set place.
So the monument with Champlain,
Yeah, in Huronia.
yeah, that does not
It's-
exist in
it's-
that location
It's
anymore.
no, it's gone. It's been removed.
Right.
It's not hasn't been destroyed. It belongs to Parks Canada, so it's in storage, pending an appropriate reappearance.
So with what little information and historical account that we have, that statue did provide some
Oh yeah.
direction.
Well, it was
about what things were like.
how Canadian history saw itself in the 1920s. You know, the great European coming and instantly dominating everything,
Yeah.
and the Indigenous as sort of eager listeners and hoping to learn something. That's how it was portrayed. That's, and when that monument was unveiled in 1925, all the Indigenous of the area were there. They were invited. They're all there.
Huh.
That was the way
Mhm.
the world was seen.
Did he go back and forth from France, or pretty well stayed in Huronia?
We don't know. There is conjecture that he did go back. There's one historian claims he did, but there's no contemporary references at all. The contemporary references you have 1615 when the trip to possibly the Susquehanna and all of that. Then in 1626, Brebeuf meets him and he talks about him. And then we know he was murdered in 1633 because the Jesuits told us. And I think Champlain wrote about it too. Because Champlain was very literate. He wrote well, and he wrote a lot. But he mainly wrote about what you could grow here, what kind of, the possibilities for settlement, and also the Indigenous. And he thought the Huron were very noble. They were the most noble of the Indigenous peoples that he'd met. And they were the farmers too. They were not nomads. So he probably felt that they were the most similar to the European idea of how people behave. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
So-
Gotta get your vote.
Okay.